You would think, by the amount of attention we pay to it in the mainline churches, that sex was the most important issue in all of Holy Scripture. All in all, I can only think of a dozen passages or so that concern matters of sexual behavior. In contrast, book after book in the Bible addresses itself to matters of justice and righteousness, poverty and wealth. It's in the prophets, like Zechariah, when he says, "Administer true justice. Do not defraud the widow and the orphan, the sojourner and the poor." It's in the Psalms. "Give justice to the weak and fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute." It's in the letters. What good is it if you say you have faith but do not have works? If a brother or sister is naked or lacks food, and you say to them, "Go in peace and keep warm and eat your fill," and yet don't supply for their needs, what is the good of that? And it's in the mouth of Jesus himself, as we read in the Gospel of Matthew. The righteous will say, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" Then the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me." Our biblical mandate is to love righteousness, to protect the poor, to care for the vulnerable. The Old Testament points to four particularly vulnerable kinds of people: the widows, the orphans, the sojourners, and the aliens in the land. Now, in their society, they had no rights, and they were at the mercy of others to protect them. Jesus expands the circle of care to include everyone in need. Anyone who's hungry or thirsty or naked or sick or imprisoned. And even this isn't meant to be an all-inclusive list beyond which we're off the hook. No, Jesus' goal is to expand our vision to look beyond categories, to look with compassion on real human beings in very real human need. Jesus invites us to care. The great Catholic writer Henry Nouwen taught a class in our seminary that he titled simply Compassion. Compassion, he reminded us, is a simple compound word that literally means suffering with. To have compassion isn't to pity or look down or try even to rescue someone in grave trouble. No, compassion begins by suffering with our neighbor in need, putting ourselves in their shoes. The greatest civic leaders have known how powerfully compassion propels us into action. One community organizer confessed, "There was a time when I believed that the basic quality I needed was a deep sense of anger against injustice, and that this was the prime motivation that kept me going. I now know that it's something else, this abnormal imagination that sweeps me into a close identification with mankind and projects me into its plight." The great lawyer Clarence Darrow put it this way: "I had a vivid imagination. Not only could I put myself in the other person's place, but I could not avoid doing so." Jesus calls us to care, to have a compassionate imagination, to suffer with our neighbors. But where do we start? Maybe the reason we avoid these passages of Scripture and focus on things like sex instead is that it's so very difficult for us to know where to begin. How do we address the enormous problems of the poor? The World Bank estimates that 1.5 billion people live in abject poverty on less than $1 a day. Millions in the U.S. try to get by without health insurance. Thousands of African babies die every day of AIDS. It's mind-boggling. And it's tempting to throw in the towel, to turn our backs and just forget about it. But that's not an option for those of us who follow Jesus. So what can we do? The reality is we can't do everything, you and I. We're not going to eradicate hunger or rescue all the children from war this evening. But we can do something. It may feel like a drop in the bucket. It may seem like Don Quixote thrusting at windmills. But Jesus invites us to do what we can anyway. His promise is that whatever we do, it will add up. It matters. When did we see you hungry and give you food, or thirsty and give you drink? The righteous asked him. And Jesus said, whenever you did it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. Instead of focusing on what we can't do, Jesus urges us to focus on what we can. My conviction is that we can do a whole lot more than we give ourselves credit for. Even little kids can bring a book to send to someone poorer than they are, or stick up for the underdog on the playground. Imagine what we can do as adults. We have unprecedented resources in America today, of money, of expertise, of political power, of passion. We live in a free democracy in which we can vote for leaders who we believe will do justice, and we can pressure them with our will to remember the most vulnerable. We can decide as a society that there's a bottom line of poverty below which we will not let our brothers and sisters fall. We can decide to open our eyes and see the crushing weight of poverty as was revealed to us when Hurricane Katrina swept through New Orleans. We can decide as consumers and investors and as leaders to make the hard call to make morality our bottom line. We can decide that justice isn't only for the wealthy, but it's for all. And in the meantime, we can be rolling up our sleeves for the little things, the daily things that all of us can be part of. Stacking cans in a food pantry, writing a letter to the editor, tutoring a child, taking soup to a shut-in, sending money to the victims of a natural disaster, visiting a prisoner, sticking up for the weak or the helpless or simply the invisible. There's a novel I turn to whenever I'm discouraged, whenever my own compassion fails me and I'm tempted to avert my eyes from sorrow. The novel is called Animal Dreams by Barbara Kingsolver. And towards the end, the hero of the story, Hallie, who's helping the poor in Central America, writes to her sister Cody back in the States. Hallie does her best to try to explain her choices. And in the process, she reminds us all what a difference every simple daily choice can make for compassion, for caring, for justice. You're thinking of justice as a great all or nothing, she says. I think of it as one more morning in a muggy cotton field, checking the undersides of leaves to see what's been there, figuring out what to do that won't clear a path for worse problems next week. Right now, that's what I do. You ask why I'm not afraid of loving and losing, and that's my answer. The daily work, that goes on, it adds up. It goes into the ground, into crops, into children's bellies and their bright eyes. Good things don't get lost. Cody, here's what I've decided. The very least you can do in your life is to figure out what you hope for. And the most you can do is to live inside that hope, not admire it from a distance, but live right in it, under its roof. What I want is so simple I almost can't say it. Elementary kindness, enough to eat, enough to go around. The possibility that kids might one day grow up to be neither the destroyers nor the destroyed. That's about it. Right now, I'm living in that hope, running down its hallway and touching the walls on both sides. When did we see you hungry and give you bread, or thirsty and give you something to eat? Whenever you did it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did so to me. All it takes is a little compassion, a little imagination, the will to see the suffering when it's tempting to avert our eyes, and the hope, the victorious hope, that every large and little thing we do will matter.